Nothing was ever said clearly. Not at the start. Not later. There were expectations, but they weren't written down. There were preferences, but they weren't named. You were supposed to know them as you went. At first, it didn't feel like a problem. People are different, situations shift. You adjusted. When something went wrong, it was framed as a misunderstanding. You were told it wasn't a big deal, that you couldn't have known. So you paid closer attention. You watched reactions. You noticed tone changes. You learned what seemed to work and what didn't. When you followed what you thought were the rules, things went smoothly. When you didn't, things felt off. Not loud, just tense. You were never told you had broken a rule. You were shown. Nothing looked unreasonable from the outside. There were no harsh demands, no strict boundaries. Just a sense that something had been missed. You told yourself this was normal, that you just needed more time, that once you understood how things worked, it would settle. The rules were there. They just weren't stable. And that was the surface you were standing on. You began to notice how often the expectations shifted. Something that was fine one day wasn't fine the next. A tone that had worked before suddenly felt wrong. A choice that had passed without comment now carried weight. No one announced the change. It just appeared. You would adjust based on what happened last time. You would remember what worked. You would try to repeat it. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. You noticed how explanations arrived after the fact. When something felt off, you were told why. The reason always made sense on its own. It just didn't help the next time. You started paying attention to timing, to mood, to who else was present. You tried to read the moment before acting in it. You noticed how often you were told, "This time is different," or "That's not what I meant then," or "You should have known this wasn't the same." Nothing was consistent long enough to learn fully, just long enough to assume. You noticed how often you questioned your memory. You remembered being told one thing. Now you were hearing another. You checked yourself before questioning it. You noticed how often you apologized. Not for doing something wrong, for not knowing what had changed. You weren't being corrected. You were being updated. And the updates never stopped. The same cycle kept happening. You would learn a rule by experience, not because it was explained, because you felt the shift when you missed it. Once you adjusted, things eased. The tension lifted. The response softened. You took that as confirmation. This is how it works. Then the rule changed. Not openly, not clearly. Just enough that what had worked before no longer did. You noticed it in small reactions, short answers, a different tone. You went back through your memory. You tried to locate the moment things moved. You looked for the mistake. Each time there was a reason, a context change, a mood, a detail you hadn't considered. It was never framed as inconsistency. It was framed as nuance. You accepted that. You told yourself this was complex. People are complex. Situations aren't fixed. So you stayed alert. You tracked patterns that didn't hold. You updated your behavior constantly. You stayed ready to adjust again. You noticed how rarely you felt sure anymore, sure of what was expected, sure of what was allowed, sure of what would be okay tomorrow. Nothing repeated long enough to feel solid. Nothing stayed the same long enough to trust. And still, you were expected to know. That was the part that kept repeating. You stopped assuming anything was fixed. You began to approach each moment as new, even familiar situations, even people you knew well. You waited to see what version of the rules was active before acting. You became careful with choices that used to feel simple. What you said, how you said it, when you said it. You watched for cues before moving forward. You learned to leave room to correct yourself, room to backtrack, room to apologize if needed. You didn't think of this as fear. You thought of it as being attentive, flexible, responsible. You adjusted your expectations first. You told yourself not to assume consistency. You told yourself to stay open. When something went smoothly, you didn't relax. You logged it. You noted what worked this time. You held it lightly, knowing it might not apply later. You noticed how often you were scamming, not just listening, scamming, for tone, for mood, for signs that the rules had shifted again. You asked more questions, not to understand, to confirm. You checked in before acting. You waited for signals before deciding. You noticed how much effort this took, how much thinking went into ordinary moments. You told yourself this was just how things were, that you were learning, that eventually it would settle. But it didn't. So you stayed ready, always ready to adjust again. Living this way started to take something from you. Not all at once, slowly. You noticed how alert you were all the time, how little you relaxed, even when things were calm. Calm didn't mean stable, it just meant nothing had shifted yet. You felt a constant need to be prepared to explain, prepared to adjust, prepared to apologize for something you didn't yet know had changed. You stopped trusting your sense of footing. You couldn't tell when you were doing well because doing well didn't last. You couldn't tell when something was wrong because the reasons arrived later. You began to doubt your own judgment, not because it was inaccurate, because it didn't seem to help. You could do everything right and still miss something. You noticed how tiring it was to stay adaptable, to never settle into understanding, to keep revising your behavior without ever reaching certainty. You felt yourself becoming smaller in decisions, more cautious, less spontaneous. You avoided committing too quickly to anything that could later be reframed. You noticed how often you replayed interactions afterward, not to dwell, to update, to prepare for next time. Your body carried this before your thoughts did. A tension, a holding, a sense of waiting for correction. Nothing dramatic happened, no clear conflict, no single breaking point. But stability never arrived. You were always responding to the last change, never standing on something solid. And you hadn't named what that was costing you. There was one thing you eventually understood. You were never learning the rules. You were chasing them. Every time you thought you had it, they moved again, not because you were careless, because they were never meant to stay still. You weren't failing to adapt. You were adapting constantly. That was the problem. You realized how little certainty you felt anymore. Not about others, about yourself. About whether your choices made sense. About whether your understanding could be trusted. Nothing had been explained clearly enough to rely on. Nothing stayed consistent long enough to settle. You weren't confused because things were complex. You were confused because the ground kept shifting. And at some point, the truth became simple. The rules didn't keep changing by accident. They were never stable to begin with. When the rules kept changing,